The Firm, India's only show on corporate law, tax and audit matters.
There's a new world war being fought on our computers, phones and all the fancy gadgetry that controls manufacturing plants, information highways and government systems. Companies, consumers, governments, we are all warriors in the war against cybercrime. Hello and welcome to The Firm. Last year, US corporations lost $400 billion to cyber attacks. The numbers are mind-boggling, the vulnerabilities terrifying, and the consequences often unimaginable. So this week, The Firm talks to security experts, hackers, chief information officers, and lawyers to find out if India Inc. is prepared to fight this new battle.
Sony, eBay, Target, Home Depot, JP Morgan, Neiman Marcus, Yahoo Mail, AT&T, UPS, and Google. They're all victims of cyber attacks. And that's just in 2014. The Washington Post says that in 2013, federal agents notified 3,000 US companies that their computer systems had been hacked. Information technology and security experts say everything is at risk. Financial data, customer data, intellectual property, and often the attackers are insiders.
We've seen details of credit cards being stolen. We've seen user information getting stolen. We've seen usernames and passwords getting stolen. We've seen various different cases that have been happening across the globe in various different areas. These are not just consumer facing, but even within the corporates, within the organizations, we've seen cases where because of hacker intrusions, we've seen some very valuable, mission critical kind of information getting leaked out into the public or going into the hands of the competition and so on and so forth.
We saw 300 million variants of malware written last year, which basically means that around 1 million per day. This is a large number of malwares which the attackers are using to exploit into the network and the infrastructure of businesses.
The type of attacks, the type of issues, probably there is a similarity to a virus or a pandemic that when it explodes, it impacts everyone.
It's a constantly mutating virus. Zahir Hidayatullah is an ethical hacker and helps companies protect themselves. He says that from widespread phishing attacks or emails that fool people into parting with their private data, hackers have now moved on to more targeted attacks.
If you think about how people used to get hacked just a few years ago, they would be targeting you and me, your credit card, my healthcare information for identity theft. That has completely changed. That's now bottom of the barrel stuff. The really serious stuff is where they're targeting companies directly. They're not saying, okay, I'll take 10,000 rupees out of 500 people's accounts. They're saying, you know what, let's break into one bank, get access to the ATM network, and let's spit out a few $1 million.
Or many $1 million. In cybercrime, data breaches are the most common form of attack. Last year, hackers accessed login information for 233 million customer accounts at eBay, one of the world's biggest online selling platforms. Soon after, JP Morgan Chase, the largest American bank with a $250 million cybersecurity budget, suffered a widespread attack on its servers that affected 76 million households and 7 million small business accounts. JP Morgan says that the attackers weren't able to get their hands on sensitive data like social security numbers, account numbers, and passwords. But IT expert Pranesh Prakash says that in this day and age of online transactions, even basic contact information can be easily exploited.
You can do a lot just by having access to a person's, birth date. You can do a lot by having access to a person's mother's maiden name and things like that, because in a few ways. One, these kinds of information are often used in financial transactions as well. They are often proof that you are you. Okay, when you are talking with a banking representative, say, for instance, the birth date. As long as you have, knowledge of a person's PAN number and the knowledge of that person's birth date, then even an income tax return that is password protected, you can have access to that.
Sensitive data is even more at risk. At American retailer Home Depot, 56 million customer accounts were reportedly hacked and financial data stolen. Media reports suggest that it cost the company $62 million and banks another $90 million to replace the debit and credit cards. Neiman Marcus, Staples, UPS, and many others have been victims of similar attacks. And then there's extortion. At Domino's Pizza, hackers stole personal records of 600,000 users. The attackers held the data for ransom by publicly threatening the company on Twitter to pay up 30,000 euros.
The number of days that a hacker can be in any of the premises is now longer than what we saw before. So they are in the network looking into the stuff that they need, intellectual property, it could be identities, the campaign is much longer and targeted rather than just going for a random kind of data. So businesses may not even know that hackers are already prevalent into their network and they're looking into something very sensitive.
Last year, a North Korean group called Guardians of Peace hacked into Sony Pictures, one of the largest film studios in Hollywood. The attackers destroyed systems and stole large quantities of employee data, confidential communications, and commercial data. They frightened Sony into cancelling the release of its film The Interview about an attempted assassination of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. The FBI said that the North Korean government was responsible for the attack. In May this year, the US Justice Department filed criminal charges against 5 hackers in the Chinese military, accusing them of stealing trade secrets from 6 American companies, including Alcoa, US Steel, and Westinghouse Electric. The cyber theft of intellectual property is now a cross-border issue for companies across the globe.
A large pharma company, obviously names not taken, was actually hacked. And we watched firsthand as Chinese malware and Chinese hackers tried to move through their network towards their lab tissue culture systems. And that information was flowing back out to a Chinese dump site. This is something that we've seen time and time again. There are 2 types of attackers. You have, for want of, locking someone down to a geography, you've got the Eastern European hackers who are more interested in, financial motive. And then you've got the Chinese hackers who are usually more after intellectual property theft.
I once saw this interesting cable from the US diplomatic cables that were leaked by WikiLeaks, where a German businessman was complaining how industrial espionage from France was a much greater threat to his business than things like the threat of IP violators and in China.
Financial data, intellectual property, even manufacturing systems have been hacked into. In 2010, in Iran, a piece of code called Stuxnet succeeded in shutting down several centrifuges in a uranium enrichment facility. In a world where everything is connected and hackers have state support, nothing is safe.
They could be taking over the entire set of assets. So if an organization has implemented IoT in its manufacturing plant or in its say warehouse or in its inventory godowns, and if they are all connected with Internet of Things, anybody who is hacking in to those networks could be completely taking the ownership or the control of those systems.
So you now know the size and the scale of the problem and its constantly changing nature. Hacking is illegal everywhere in the world, but that's not much of a deterrent, is it? So the question is, how are companies across the world coping? Last year, 60% of all attacks on corporations reportedly took place in the US. But that's probably because US law mandates that companies report data breaches where customer data has been stolen. Many countries, including the EU, now have data breach reporting laws as well. So disclosures is the first step. The next is laws that protect data.
Lisa Soto is a reputed lawyer and partner at Hunton & Williams. She specializes in cybercrime matters and has advised various governments around the world on data security and breach notification laws. She says that the US has a plethora of laws, but they are all fighting yesterday's battle.
Our clients ask us all the time if we could provide the playbook. What is the roadmap for securing data? What playbook should they follow for data security? And unfortunately, the answer is there's no magic potion. There is no playbook. So what we have in the United States is really a hodgepodge of laws. We have financial security laws, we have health care security requirements, and then as a general security requirement, the Federal Trade Commission requires that we have reasonable security in place to protect data. And of course, the term reasonable is a bit of a moving target, because what's reasonable today may be less than reasonable tomorrow as the cyber criminals become more and more sophisticated and they figure out how to get past certain security measures that are in place. So we do not have a single rule of thumb.
In 2013, one of the biggest retail chains in the US, Target's payment system was infected with malware. Attackers stole credit card information of 70 million customers. The attack cost Target $148 million, and banks lost $200 million. Target's CEO resigned, government investigations were launched, and the company had to pay $10 million to settle a class action lawsuit brought by consumers. More recently, Home Depot and Ashley Madison have been sued by customers for failing to protect their data. After last year's cyber attack, Sony faced employee lawsuits for not doing enough to protect their data. Inadequate data protection can also prompt government enforcement actions.
The government does it all the time, and I should say governments, because in the United States we are faced with enforcement actions by the Federal Trade Commission at the federal level, possibly the Department of Health and Human Services with respect to health data, and other federal agencies where we have compromises of data. We also, in private industry, are faced with Attorney General action. So the states are very active, and we may be faced with multiple actions by Attorneys General if we fail to protect data.
The costs, the class action litigation, and the government enforcement action, that's just half the story. Reputational damage can be equally crippling. Many American companies are now adding cybersecurity experts to their boards and senior management. But what about India Inc.? Well, after the break, our ethical hacker Sahir has some very interesting experiences to share. Welcome back. You're watching a special edition of The Firm on cybercrime. There's little data on cyber attacks on Indian companies. The issue rarely makes headlines, but it is slowly gaining traction in boardrooms, especially in bank boardrooms, because India's financial services industry is a prime target.
RBI says that $12.6 billion worth of cyber fraud cases were reported last year. Amit Sethi, the Chief Information Officer at Axis Bank, contends that the frequency and magnitude of attacks has gone up in the last 5 years, and that's led him to change his security strategy.
Two very important things are happening. The original strategy used to be defense only. So build a perimeter firewall, build your whole strategy around a defensive mechanism. That has changed now. So it's moving more to what we call as predictive and responsive mechanism. So we are able to predict on the basis of certain traffic patterns or on the basis of what we hear from the underground, the dark web, about what is the likelihood of the attack. So we are getting into predictive, and when we see the traffic increase or an attack happening, have an immediate response. So responsiveness has increased at a very fast. So these are the two new additions which have happened over the last few years and few months over and above the defensive strategy.
It's this change in strategy that's made ethical hackers like Sahir Hidayatullah much sought after. Sahir helps Indian companies prevent and counter hack attacks, and he has some interesting stories to tell.
Fortune 50 CEO of an Indian company received an email purportedly from a person who used to write articles on him from a news publication. Once again, that email had a virus attached to it, and that virus, when it was analyzed, was capable of switching on the audio, the microphone on his computer, turning on the camera, downloading Excel, Word documents, recording the keystrokes, recording the screen, pretty much everything the hacker could want to do if he was sitting in front of that system. And you must understand, the cost to the attacker is minimal for him to send this out. He could just make a list of all the top executives in India and fire that same thing out, and it's basically the cost of sending an email.
In another instance that Sahir shared, hackers infiltrated a company's systems by sending a well-crafted spear phishing email to an executive assistant of a senior executive in a company. Once in, they accessed the system for months.
They were able to move from system to system, and over a period of months, they gained access to what they wanted to, and then siphoning it off was a simple matter. We were able to, luckily in that case, figure out that something was wrong, because there was they misused the password out of office hours, and for some reason this lady received some sort of an alert which said, you tried to log in last night at 3 in the morning, and that's how the whole incident kind of started unraveling. And once we got in, we realized we can't just shut these guys down. If we just close off her access, they'll realize that we figured out they're there, and they might have 5 other backdoors. So it was really important that we kept them going. So we in fact built an elaborate deception around what information they were getting. We drew them away from the real information, but kept them busy while we could figure out and dimension the incident, and finally then shut them down cleanly one weekend. So I think the operative takeaway in that is, you don't need to have the strongest, perimeter firewall. It's not going to help you if somebody's just going to give up their username and password.
Cybercrime has seen a 350% increase in India, and yet there's rarely news of an attack on an Indian company. That's because India has no law that requires companies to report hacking attacks or data breaches.
There have been a number of instances where very large Indian companies have been hit by targeted attacks. They've not made the news for various reasons, including the lack of breach reporting laws that we have here. But there have been serious incidents. In fact, if you look over any advanced persistent threat report of the last few years, you will usually find India figures in one of the top 5 targets.
If you see there is no mandatory reporting, means lesser crimes are reported, and the indices which are projected to from surveys or research may not give the real picture, because the current threats may be even far more than what they're being projected. And because there is less reporting, there is less investigation, there is less tracking of offences, and as a result less prosecution and convictions.
Karnika Seth is a well-known lawyer specializing in cybercrime matters. She has also advised the government on matters of cyber security. Karnika says that India is woefully under-equipped.
Well, our current IT system and the IT law and the legal framework, the machinery or the infrastructure, even the manpower which handles this kind of investigations is certainly way behind what we should be now, because I feel the awareness levels are very low, and because of that the cyber criminals find it as a haven.
In the year 2000, the Indian Parliament passed its first cyber law, the Information Technology Act. Section 66 of the Act makes hacking illegal. Section 43A provides for compensation to victims of data breach, and Section 72A imposes criminal liability on a person who discloses confidential information.
every customer's personal information taken should be protected to an extent which ensures reasonable security practices have been adopted by that corporation or a company. And how many corporations really follow this is what is a big challenge today.
43A, which is the provision relating to data protection, and is the only provision really relating to data protection as we understand it, is grossly inadequate. The one example of why it's inadequate is that it doesn't really have allow the capability for suo motu action by the government, meaning it in essence envisages complaints by victims for claiming this kind of compensation, which very often does not happen, and the kind of negligence that has to be shown, well, it's unclear, and what we see is that despite it being many years since this provision was introduced, I don't know of a single case where it's actually been used.
Since companies rarely disclose if they've been attacked, consumers, despite the legal provisions, have little opportunity to take action, and class action is a rarity here in India. On the other hand, catching and prosecuting hackers is no easy job either. But as the problem grows, so has the awareness. Now, government intelligence agencies such as the National Technical Research Organization, that's NTRO, and the Computer Emergency Response Team, CERT, are also coming to the aid of Indian business.
We have seen agencies like that, step in now. They are extremely collaborative, where extreme information exchange is happening between agencies, and we see them as active participants in both prevention and detection of these kind of things. So yes, they are actually playing quite an important role in this.
There's no point having the laws if we don't have the teeth to enforce them, or the investigative capabilities to enforce them. Right now it's difficult enough for our police to deal with the type of cybercrime that we see daily. If you're talking about them dealing with a really advanced gang, that's difficult. There have been victories, and there are quite a few officers who have done a lot of work and are very knowledgeable on the subject, but unfortunately they're few and far between.
But that's not a problem unique to India. Constantly changing technology has helped hackers stay one step ahead of investigating authorities everywhere. Finding them is tough, prosecuting them even tougher.
Cyber criminals are really operating in a space that is above jurisdictional lines or beyond jurisdictional lines. So finding them, identifying them when they're talented enough to leave very few footprints after they've been in a system is a huge challenge.
Tracking is definitely possible. We are able to track them down to the countries of origination or the place from where the attack has originated. In terms of prosecution, because it involves cross-border, you need to involve government agencies. I believe that's one area of improvement where all of us need to work together, where we need to have better, all the international community has to have a better mechanism of prosecution for cross-border. I think most of the countries are struggling with that, and I hope soon we will see some work and some outcome.
There is no cybercrime convention, so whether the cross-border crimes could be easily investigated, because MLAT system which we currently follow, the mutual legal assistance treaty system with certain countries, is also very slow, and many times when we look for information from the other authority in the other country, it could take 6 months or even 1 year.
Well, as is evident, we are struggling to keep up. It's not just the legal and enforcement architecture or better laws to protect customer data. Cybercrime is forcing companies everywhere to rework security and governance systems. Is that conversation happening in Indian boardrooms?
The awareness over the last few years, if you look at India Inc. in general and government, it's increased tremendously, and that has happened also because of the kind of attacks that we are seeing. And actually, your digital property is becoming the face for most of the companies, and if that gets attacked, it is both not only a reputation risk, it could actually risk release of sensitive data outside. So everyone is taking it extremely seriously. Over the last 2 years especially, I have seen that become as an important part of their strategy. and board level reviews. So, the top management of the company is also extremely involved in these things.
The boards do realize that security is an issue. Securing their assets, IT assets and information assets are critical to them. But do they have all the relevant knowledge from a technology perspective, from the perspective of what kind of impact it can have for the business continuity planning, or probably disaster recovery management and so on and so forth? The awareness levels I would guess is still pretty average, is what I would say, at least in the Indian context.
I'll end where I started. Last year, US corporations lost $400 billion to cybercrime. India Inc., beware. Thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next week.
The Firm, India's only show on corporate law, tax and audit matters.